The forest was quiet that afternoon, and Lieutenant Maya Torres liked it that way, because it meant she could focus on her work without distractions. And she had been walking through these woods for 3 weeks now, mapping the terrain and taking samples of local plants and recording animal behavior. And it was peaceful work that gave her time to think about things other than military protocols and fleet regulations. Maya had joined the United Earth Alliance because she wanted to see the galaxy and help people, and so far she had done plenty of seeing, but not much helping because most of her assignments involved paperwork and standing guard duty on cargo ships. And this mapping mission was supposed to be easy and boring and a chance to get some field experience before she got assigned to a real medical posting. She was thinking about lunch when she heard the sound. It started as a distant roar like thunder, but wrong somehow. And then came the crashing and breaking of trees, and the ground shook hard enough that Maya stumbled and had to grab a nearby trunk to keep from falling. And her training kicked in immediately, and she was running toward the noise before she even realized she had made the decision to move. The med kit bounced against her hip as she ran, and branches whipped at her face and arms. But she ignored them because something big had just fallen out of the sky, and there might be survivors who needed help. And that was what medics did, and they ran toward danger instead of away from it because someone had to. When she burst through the tree line into a large clearing, she stopped so fast that she almost tripped over her own feet. The dragon was massive and easily as long as a shuttle and covered in scales that gleamed like polished emeralds in the afternoon sunlight, and one wing was stretched out at a normal angle, but the other was bent backwards in a way that made Maya feel sick just looking at it, and there was blood on the ground beneath. The damaged wing and the dragon was making a low whimpering sound that reminded Maya of an injured dog she had rescued as a child. Standing next to the dragon was a woman like nothing Maya had ever seen before. She was tall and slender with silver hair that fell past her waist in a thick braid, and her skin had a faint golden glow that seemed to come from inside, and her eyes were pure gold without any white or pupil, and she wore armor made of some dark metal that looked both ancient and impossibly advanced, and there were tears running down her face, and her hands were pressed against the dragon's side, and she was whispering something in a language Maya did not understand. Maya knew immediately that this was one of the Selenari, and everyone in the fleet had heard about them because they ruled this entire sector of space. And they were elves who believed themselves superior to every other species in the galaxy, and they treated other races like servants or worse, and the official policy was to be polite but firm, and to never show weakness because the Selenari respected strength and nothing else. But this woman did not look superior or dangerous, and she just looked terrified and heartbroken. The woman must have heard Maya because she turned fast and her hand went to the curved blade at her belt, and she pulled it halfway out of its sheath, and her golden eyes were wide and wild, and Maya realized that the woman thought she was a threat. Maya raised both hands, slowly, and kept them where the woman could see them, and she made her voice as calm and steady as possible, even though her heart was pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. And she said, "I am not here to hurt you, and I am a medic, and I can help your dragon if you let me." The woman stared at her for what felt like forever, and her hand stayed on her weapon, and Maya could see her weighing options and calculating risks. And finally she spoke in heavily accented English, and her voice was rough, like she had been crying for a long time, and she said, "You are human." Maya nodded and said, "Yes, and my name is Maya Torres, and I am a lieutenant in the United Earth Alliance Medical Corps, and I promise I only want to help." The woman looked at Maya, and then at the dragon, and then back at Maya, and something in her expression shifted, and the desperation won out over the suspicion, and she slowly released her weapon and said, "My name is Lyris Moonwhisper, and this is Silverwind, and she is my bonded dragon, and we were attacked by Imperial hunters, and her wing is broken, and I do not know how to fix it, and if she cannot fly, we will both die." Here Maya moved slowly toward the dragon and kept talking in that same calm voice because that was what you did with injured animals and frightened people. And she said, "I have treated broken bones before, and wings are just modified arms when you think about it, and I have splints and painkillers and antibiotics in my kit, and I will do everything I can to help." Silverwind watched Maya approach, and the dragon's eyes were the same golden color as Lyris's eyes, and there was intelligence in that gaze that made Maya understand this was not just an animal, but a thinking feeling, person, and she knelt beside the injured wing and gently touched the scales near the break, and Silverwind flinched, but did not pull away. The wing was worse up close than it had looked from a distance, and the bones were definitely broken in at least 2 places, and the membrane was torn, and there was more blood than Maya had initially thought, and this was going to take hours of careful work, and she was going to need Lyris's help. Maya looked up at Lyris and said, "I need you to keep her calm, and talk to her and let her know what I am doing, and this is going to hurt, but I will be as gentle as I can." Lyris knelt on the other side of Silverwind and pressed her forehead against the dragon's neck, and whispered something in that musical language, and Silverwind made a low rumbling sound, and Maya took that as permission to begin. She opened her medkit and pulled out the portable scanner and ran it over the wing to get a better picture of the damage, and the results made her wince. Because there were 3 breaks, not 2, and one of them was dangerously close to a major blood vessel, and if she was not careful, she could make things much worse. But Maya had not become a medic, because she liked easy problems. She pulled out the local anesthetic and injected it carefully around the break sites and waited for it to take effect, and then she began the slow process of setting the bones, and it required all of her focus and both of her hands, and several times she had to stop and wipe sweat from her forehead, and Lyris watched her work with an expression of wonder and fear mixed together. The sun was setting by the time Maya finished splinting the wing and wrapping it in the lightweight carbon fiber supports that were designed for field injuries, and she had used almost all of her medical supplies, and her hands were shaking from fatigue and adrenaline, but the wing was as stable as she could make it, and Silverwind was resting quietly with her head in Lyris's lap. Lyris looked at Maya with tears in her eyes again, but this time they looked like different tears, and she said, "Why would you do this for us? And you are human, and we are strangers, and helping us could anger the Empire." Maya sat back on her heels and smiled tiredly and said, "Because you needed help, and because that is what decent people do, and they help each other when they can." Lyris stared at her like Maya had just said something in a completely alien language, and maybe she had. Night fell over the forest, and Maya built a small fire, while Lyris stayed close to Silverwind and stroked the dragon's scales and whispered soft words in that musical language that Maya was starting to find beautiful, even though she could not understand it, and the dragon's breathing had settled into a slow, steady rhythm that suggested she was finally resting comfortably, and that was a good sign, because it meant the pain medication was working. Maya heated a ration pack over the fire and offered half to Lyris, but the elf woman shook her head and said that Selenari could not eat human food because their biology was too different, and Maya nodded and made a mental note to ask about that later when things were less intense, because she was genuinely curious about how different species evolved and what made them compatible or incompatible with each other. After eating, Maya checked Silverwind's wing again and adjusted the splint slightly and applied more antibiotic gel to the torn membrane, and the dragon watched her work with those intelligent golden eyes and made a sound that was almost like a purr. And Maya smiled and said, "You are very brave, and you are going to heal just fine." Lyris was watching Maya with an odd expression, and finally she spoke, and her voice was quiet and thoughtful, and she said, "I have never met anyone like you before." Maya glanced over at her and raised an eyebrow and said, "What do you mean?" Lyris hesitated like she was choosing her words carefully, and then said, "In the Empire, we are taught that other species are lesser, and that they exist to serve the Selenari, or to stay out of our way. And we are taught that humans especially are primitive and violent and barely civilized, and that you only recently discovered space travel and have nothing to offer the galaxy except chaos and conflict." Maya felt a flash of anger at that, but pushed it down because getting defensive would not help anyone. And besides, she had heard worse from other species, who thought humans were too aggressive or too emotional or too unpredictable, and she had learned that the best response was to just prove them wrong through actions instead of arguments. So instead of arguing, she just said, "And what do you think now?" Lyris looked at Silverwind and then at Maya and said, "I think that anyone who would spend hours saving a stranger's dragon in the middle of nowhere with no thought of reward or recognition is not primitive or lesser, and I think that perhaps the Empire has been wrong about many things." They sat in silence for a while and listened to the crackling of the fire and the sounds of the night forest, and Maya found herself wondering what it must be like to grow up in a culture that taught you that you were better than everyone else, and then to have that belief shattered by something as simple as an act of kindness. Finally, Maya asked the question that had been bothering her since she first saw them, and she said, "Why were you being hunted? And what did you do to make the Empire send soldiers after you?" Lyris's face went hard and cold, and for a moment, Maya saw the proud Selenari warrior that everyone warned humans about. And then the expression softened into something sadder, and she said, "I refused to marry Lord Kalen Starfire, and he is from one of the oldest and most powerful families in the Empire. And our marriage was arranged when I was a child, and I was supposed to be honored by the match." Maya waited because she could tell there was more to the story. Lyris continued, and her voice was bitter now, and she said, "But Kalen is cruel, and he treats his servants like property. And he has killed 3 bonded dragons because their riders displeased him, and bonded dragons are sacred, and killing one is the worst crime a Selenari can commit. But his family is too powerful and no one will challenge him. And I told my family I would rather die than marry him, and they sent hunters after you," Maya said quietly. Lyris nodded and said, "Yes, and my own uncle leads the hunter squad, and he believes I am bringing shame to our family, and that I should accept my duty and stop being selfish. And he does not understand that I cannot bond my life to someone who would hurt Silverwind, just to punish me for speaking my mind." Maya felt her anger return, but this time it was not at Lyris or even at the Selenari in general, and it was at the kind of system that would force someone into a marriage with a monster and then call them selfish for refusing. And she had seen similar things on Earth in the history books and in some places that still clung to old ways, and she hated it. She said, "You did the right thing, and running took more courage than staying would have." Lyris looked surprised and said, "Most people would say I am a coward." Maya shook her head firmly and said, "Most people are wrong, and staying in a situation that will destroy you is not brave, and it is just slow suicide, and getting out takes real strength." Lyris was quiet for a long time, and when she finally spoke, her voice was thick with emotion, and she said, "Thank you, and not just for helping Silverwind, but for understanding." They talked for hours that night, and Lyris told Maya about life in the Selenari Empire, and about the strict hierarchy and the ancient families who controlled everything, and the way that tradition was valued above individual happiness, and how anyone who challenged the old ways was cast out or forced to submit. And Maya told Lyris about Earth and about the wars humans had fought to end slavery and oppression, and about how humanity had almost destroyed itself several times before finally learning to work together. Lyris listened with fascination, and she asked questions about human history and human culture and human beliefs about freedom and choice, and Maya answered as best she could, and realized that she was seeing the Selenari not as the proud superior beings that everyone described, but as people who were trapped in a system that had been going on for so long that most of them could not imagine any other way. When the fire burned low, Maya added more wood, and Lyris leaned against Silverwind's side and closed her eyes and said that she had not felt safe enough to sleep in 3 days, and Maya said that she would keep watch and that Lyris should rest. Lyris opened one golden eye and said, "Why do you keep helping us, and what do you want in return?" Maya smiled and said, "I do not want anything, and this is just what I do. But there must be something," Lyris insisted, "and in the Empire nothing is free and everyone wants something." Maya thought about that and finally said, "If you really want to give me something, then tell me about dragon bonding, and I have never seen anything like it, and I want to understand." Lyris smiled for the first time since Maya had met her, and it transformed her face from beautiful to radiant, and she said, "That is a fair trade, and I will teach you everything I know," and she did. Over the next 3 days, while Silverwind rested and healed, Lyris explained how dragon bonding worked, and how it was not like having a pet or even a partner, but something deeper and more fundamental. And she said that when a Selenari bonded with a dragon, their minds touched and they could feel each other's emotions and share each other's thoughts, and they became 2 parts of one whole. Maya listened and learned and asked questions and slowly began to understand why killing a bonded dragon was the worst crime in Selenari culture, and it would be like killing half of someone's soul. She also learned that Lyris was an incredible teacher, and that despite everything she had been through, she still had hope and humor, and a sharp wit that made Maya laugh, and Maya realized she was starting to think of this elf woman not as a stranger, or even as a patient, but as a friend. On the 4th day, Silverwind stood up for the first time and stretched her good wing and made a trumpeting sound that echoed through the forest, and Lyris cried with joy and hugged Maya so hard that it hurt, and Maya hugged her back, and thought that maybe this assignment was not going to be boring after all. Maya had been living in the forest with Lyris and Silverwind for 2 weeks when she made the decision that would change everything, and she was checking Silverwind's wing for the 3rd time that day when she realized that the dragon was healing faster than she had expected, and the bones were already starting to knit back together, and the torn membrane was closing up, and in another week or 2 Silverwind would be able to fly again. That should have been good news, but instead Maya felt a cold knot of worry forming in her stomach because once Silverwind could fly, Lyris would leave and she would be alone again, and the hunters would still be out there looking for her, and sooner or later, they would find her, and Maya could not shake the feeling that something bad was going to happen. Lyris must have sensed her mood because she came over and sat down beside Maya and said, "You are worried." Maya nodded and said, "I am worried about what happens when you leave, and those hunters are still out there. And what if they catch you?" Lyris smiled sadly and said, "Then they catch me, and I have accepted that this might be how my story ends, and at least I got to live free for a little while, and I got to meet you." "That is not good enough," Maya said sharply, "and you deserve better than that." Lyris looked surprised and said, "What would you have me do? And I cannot fight 6 trained hunters on my own. And even if I could, where would I go? And the Empire controls this entire sector, and there is nowhere to hide." Forever. Maya was quiet for a moment, and then she pulled out her communicator and stared at it. And she had been avoiding this decision for 2 weeks because she knew it would complicate everything, and it might even get her court-martialed. But she also knew it was the right thing to do. She said, "I'm going to call for backup." Lyris went very still and said, "What do you mean?" Maya took a deep breath and said, "I mean, I am going to contact my ship and tell them what is happening and ask them to send support, and humans do not abandon their friends. And you are my friend now, whether you like it or not. But that could start a war," Lyris said, and her voice was urgent and worried, "and the Empire will see it as an act of aggression, and your people could die because of me." Maya met her eyes and said, "Or the Empire will see that humans protect the people we care about, and that we do not tolerate bullies, and maybe that will make them think twice before sending hunters after innocent people, and besides, my captain is smart and she will know how to handle this." Before Lyris could argue, Maya activated the communicator and sent out an encrypted message to the UEA ship Horizon that had dropped her off 3 weeks ago, and she explained the situation as clearly as she could and requested immediate assistance, and then she waited. The response came faster than she expected. Captain Holland's voice crackled through the speaker, calm and professional like always, and she said, "Lieutenant Torres, we received your message and we have been monitoring your position since you went dark 2 weeks ago, and we were about to send a search team. And can you confirm that you are asking for military intervention in a Selenari internal matter?" Maya hesitated because phrasing it like that made it sound more serious than it felt, but she knew that was exactly what she was asking for, and she said, "Yes, Captain, and I am requesting protection for a Selenari citizen who is being persecuted for refusing a forced marriage, and she has committed no crime, and the hunters pursuing her are acting on behalf of a powerful family, not the Empire itself." There was a long pause, and Maya could almost hear Captain Holland thinking through all the political implications, and finally, the captain said, "Understood. And we will deploy a support team to your location, and ETA is 6 hours, and sit tight and do not engage the hunters if they arrive before we do." And Holland out. Maya put down the communicator and looked at Lyris and said, "Help is coming." Lyris stared at her with an expression that was part shock and part something else that Maya could not quite identify, and she said, "You just risked your career, and maybe your life for me." And why? Maya shrugged and said, "Because it is the right thing to do, and because I meant it when I said we do not abandon friends, and humans have a saying about standing up for people who cannot stand up for themselves." Lyris was quiet for a long time, and then she said, "I do not understand your species, and you are confusing and frustrating and wonderful all at the same time." Maya laughed and said, "Yeah, we get that a lot." The hunters arrived 5 hours later. Maya heard them before she saw them, and there was the sound of wings beating the air and the crashing of trees being pushed aside, And then 6 dragons descended into the clearing, and they were huge and easily twice the size of Silverwind, and covered in scales that ranged from deep red to midnight black, and their riders wore crimson armor that marked them as Imperial Guards. The leader was a tall elf man with a scar running down his left cheek and eyes like frozen amber, and he dismounted smoothly and walked toward Lyris with the confidence of someone who had never lost a fight, and his hand rested casually on the hilt of his sword. Lyris stood up straight and lifted her chin, and Maya was impressed by how calm she looked, even though she could see the fear in her friend's eyes. The hunter captain spoke in the Selenari language, and his voice was cold and formal, and Lyris responded in the same language, and her voice was steady and defiant, and Maya did not understand the words, but she understood the tone, and this was not going to end peacefully. Then the captain switched to English and looked at Maya with open contempt, and he said, "You are the human who has been harboring a fugitive, and you will step aside and let us take Lyris Moonwhisper into custody, and if you interfere, you will be arrested as well." Maya stepped forward and positioned herself between the captain and Lyris, and she said, "I am Lieutenant Maya Torres of the United Earth Alliance, and Lyris Moonwhisper is under my protection, and you will not take her anywhere." The captain laughed, and it was not a pleasant sound, and he said, "One human medic with a sidearm thinks she can stop 6 Imperial hunters, and this is amusing. And your people really are as foolish as we were told." Maya smiled, and it was the same smile her grandmother used to give people who underestimated her right before she proved them wrong, and she said, "You are probably right about one human. But I have not been alone for the past week." She tapped her communicator and said, "Captain Holland, this is Torres, and I need that support." Now the sky above the clearing filled with the sound of engines, and 6 human shuttles dropped through the clouds in perfect formation, and their hulls gleamed in the sunlight, and their weapon systems powered up with a high-pitched whine that made the hunter captain take a step backward. Captain Holland's voice came through Maya's communicator, clear and commanding, and she said, "This is Captain Holland of the UEA Horizon, and Lieutenant Torres is operating under my authority, and any attempt to harm her or her companions will be considered an act of war against the United Earth Alliance, and I strongly suggest you reconsider your current course of action." The clearing was suddenly very quiet except for the hum of the shuttle engines, and Maya watched the hunter captain's face go through several expressions, and shock and anger, and calculation, and finally uncertainty. One of the other hunters said something in the Selenari language, and the captain snapped back at him. And there was a heated discussion among the group, and Maya kept her hand near her sidearm and hoped that she would not actually have to use it, because she was a medic, not a soldier, and shooting people was not what she had signed up for. Finally, the captain looked at Maya with an expression of pure hatred, and he said, "This is not over, and the Empire will remember this insult." Then he and his hunters mounted their dragons and took off, and the wind from their wings nearly knocked Maya off her feet, and she watched them disappear into the western sky. When they were gone, Maya let out a breath she had not realized she was holding, and her legs suddenly felt weak, and she sat down hard on the ground. Lyris knelt beside her and took her hand and said, "You just declared war on the Selenari Empire for me." Maya squeezed her hand and said, "Technically, Captain Holland did that, and I just asked nicely." Captain Holland turned out to be a woman in her 50s, with gray hair and sharp blue eyes, and the kind of calm presence that made everyone around her feel safer. And when she stepped out of her shuttle, she looked at the situation, and at Maya, and at Lyris. And then she smiled and said, "Well, Lieutenant Torres, you certainly know how to make things interesting." Maya stood and saluted and said, "I am sorry, Captain, and I know I probably should have asked permission before calling in air support, but there was not much time, and I made a judgment." Call Holland waved her hand dismissively and said, "You did exactly what you were supposed to do, and you protected an innocent person from persecution, and that is what we are supposed to stand for. And besides, this gives me an excuse to have a very interesting conversation with the Selenari High Command." She turned to Lyris and switched to flawless Selenari and introduced herself formally, and Lyris looked shocked that a human could speak her language so perfectly, and she responded with equal formality, and the two of them spoke for several minutes while Maya stood there feeling useless because she did not understand a word. Finally, Holland switched back to English and said, Miss Moonwhisper has explained the situation. And I have to say that I am not impressed with your empire's marriage customs, and on Earth we stopped forcing people into unwanted marriages about 300 years ago. And maybe it is time your people caught up. Lyres actually laughed at that. And it was the first time Maya had heard her really laugh, and the sound was like music. Holland continued and said, I am going to contact the Selenari Diplomatic Corps and explain that Lieutenant Torres acted under my orders when she provided you with protection, and I am also going to make it very clear that the United Earth Alliance considers forced marriage to be a violation of basic sentient rights, and that we will not tolerate such practices in our sphere of influence. But Captain Lyris said, and her voice was uncertain, and this sector belongs to the Empire, and you do not have authority. Here Holland smiled, and it was a dangerous smile, and she said, that is where you are wrong. And under the Galactic Council's Treaty of Sovereign Rights, any species has the authority to protect individuals whose fundamental rights are being violated, and forced marriage qualifies, and your empire might be old and powerful. But they are also signatories to that treaty, and that means they have to follow the rules. Maya felt a surge of pride, because this was why she had joined the Alliance, and not because of the ships or the technology, but because humans believed in standing up for what was right, even when it was difficult or dangerous. Over the next week, Maya watched as Captain Holland worked diplomatic magic, and she contacted the Selenari High Command and explained the situation, and she did it in a way that made it clear that humans were not trying to start a war, but were simply enforcing established galactic law, and she also made it clear that humans would not back down on this issue no matter how much pressure the Empire applied. The Selenari response was predictable, and they sent strongly worded messages about interference in internal matters, and about respecting cultural traditions, and about the arrogance of young species who thought they knew better than civilizations that had existed for thousands of years. Holland responded to each message with calm logic and citations from the treaty, and polite but firm insistence that basic rights were not negotiable. And after 3 days of back-and-forth communication, the Selenari High Command finally agreed to a formal hearing. Lyris would be allowed to present her case before the Empress herself, and if the Empress ruled in her favor, then the marriage contract would be dissolved and she would be granted protection from future persecution, and if the Empress ruled against her, then she would be forced to either accept the marriage or be exiled from Selenari space forever. It was not a perfect solution, but it was better than being hunted, and Lyris agreed to attend the hearing, on the condition that Maya would be allowed to come with her as a witness and support her. Captain Holland agreed, and she assigned 2 diplomatic officers to accompany them, and she also quietly stationed the Horizon in orbit above the Selenari capital world, with orders to evacuate Maya and Lyris immediately if things went wrong. The journey to the capital took 2 days, and Maya spent most of that time helping Lyris prepare her testimony, and they practiced answering difficult questions and anticipating counter-arguments. And Maya was struck by how brave Lyris was, and she was about to stand in front of the most powerful person in the Empire and argue that tradition was wrong, and that was terrifying. The Selenari capital was called Lumina, and it was the most beautiful city Maya had ever seen, and it was built on floating islands connected by bridges of light, and the buildings were made of crystal that changed color with the sun, and everywhere she looked there were gardens and fountains and dragons soaring through the sky. The Imperial Palace was at the center of the city, and it was a massive structure that seemed to grow out of a single piece of white stone, and the entrance hall alone was bigger than most buildings on Earth, and the ceiling was so high that clouds formed near the top. They were met by an Imperial escort who looked at Maya with barely concealed disdain, but treated Lyris with careful respect, and they were led through corridors lined with ancient tapestries and statues of past rulers, and finally into a vast chamber, where the Empress held court. Empress Kalira was perhaps the most striking person Maya had ever seen, and she looked ageless, though she was probably thousands of years old, and her hair was pure silver and fell to the floor behind her throne, and her eyes were the same gold as all Selenari, but somehow deeper and more intense, and when she looked at you, it felt like she could see right through to your soul. The chamber was filled with nobles and courtiers all dressed in elaborate robes, and all watching with expressions of curiosity and judgment, and Maya felt very small and very human and very out of place. The hearing began with formal introductions, and then Lyris was asked to present her case, and she spoke clearly and calmly about why she had refused to marry Kalen Starfire, and she talked about his cruelty and his disregard for the lives of bonded dragons, and she explained that she believed forcing her into this marriage would violate everything the Selenari were supposed to stand for. Then Kalen himself was given a chance to speak, and he was exactly as unpleasant as Maya had imagined, and he argued that Lyris was being selfish and that their marriage had been arranged to strengthen both families, and that personal feelings were irrelevant when it came to duty and tradition. Maya watched the Empress's face during all of this, and she could not read her expression at all. And finally, when both sides had finished speaking, the Empress turned to Maya and said, "You are the human who interfered in this matter, and what do you have to say?" Maya stood and she felt her heart pounding, but she kept her voice steady and she said, "Your Majesty, I interfered because I saw someone who needed help, and in my culture we believe that every person has the right to choose their own path, and forcing someone into a marriage against their will is wrong, no matter what tradition says, and sometimes traditions need to change." The chamber erupted in angry murmurs, and several nobles stood and shouted that humans had no right to lecture the Selenari about tradition. But the Empress raised one hand, and everyone fell silent immediately. She looked at Maya for a long moment, and then she said, "You are very bold for such a young species, and tell me, do humans never follow tradition?" Maya took a breath and said, "We follow traditions that make sense and that bring us together and make us stronger, but we abandon traditions that hurt people or hold us back, and we used to have traditions about slavery and about treating women as property and about punishing people for who they loved. And we got rid of those traditions because they were wrong. And change is hard, but it is necessary." The Empress smiled, and it was a small smile, but it was there, and she said, "You make a compelling argument, young human, and perhaps we have much to learn from each other." The Empress stood and the entire chamber fell silent, and Maya realized she was holding her breath. And beside her, Lyris had gone very still, and this was the moment that would determine everything. Empress Kalyra spoke, and her voice carried through the vast chamber without effort, and she said, "I have ruled this empire for 3,000 years, and in that time I have seen many things, and I have upheld our traditions because they connect us to our ancestors and give us identity and purpose. But I have also watched as other species grew and changed and adapted while we remained fixed in our ways, and I have wondered if our greatest strength might also be our greatest weakness." She paused and looked around the chamber at all the nobles and courtiers, and then continued, and she said, "Tradition is important, but it must serve the people, not the other way around, and Lord Kalen Starfire, you have been accused of cruelty and of killing bonded dragons. And these are serious charges, and do you deny them?" Kalen stood and his face was red with anger, and he said, "I have disciplined servants who failed in their duties, and if their dragon suffered as a consequence, that is unfortunate, but not illegal, and the law allows me to punish those in my service, as I see fit." The Empress's expression went cold, and she said, "The law allows you to punish servants, yes, but bonded dragons are not property, and they are sentient beings with rights of their own, and killing them to punish their riders is murder, and I am revoking your right to keep bonded servants, and you will release all those currently in your service immediately." The chamber erupted in shocked whispers, and Kalen looked like he had been slapped, and he started to protest, but the Empress silenced him with a look. She turned to Lyris and said, "As for the matter of your marriage contract, I am dissolving it, and you are free to refuse any marriage you do not desire, and no one will force you into such a union. And furthermore, I am declaring that all arranged marriages within the Empire must have the consent of both parties, and forced marriage is now a crime punishable by exile." Maya felt tears spring to her eyes, and she looked at Lyris and saw that her friend was crying too, and they grabbed each other's hands and squeezed hard. But the Empress was not finished, and she turned to Maya and said, "Lieutenant Torres, you have shown us that courage and compassion are not limited to any one species, and you risked much to help a stranger, and that is the mark of true honor, and I would like to extend an invitation to your people to establish a formal embassy here on Lumina. And perhaps it is time the Selenari Empire learned from humanity, as much as humanity might learn from us. Maya managed to stammer out a thank you, and the Empress smiled. And then the formal hearing was over, and the nobles began filing out, and many of them looked angry or confused, but several looked thoughtful, and Maya hoped that meant something good. After the hearing, Captain Holland met them in a private room, and she was grinning like she had just won the lottery, and she said, "Well done, both of you." And that went better than I could have hoped, and the Empress basically just reformed their entire marriage system and gave us diplomatic recognition all in one speech. And I am going to have a lot of paperwork to do, but it is worth it. Lyra said, "I cannot believe she ruled in my favor, and I thought for certain she would uphold tradition and force me to marry Kalen or exile me." Holland said, "I think you underestimated her, and she has been ruling for 3,000 years, and you do not stay in power that long without being smart and adaptable. And she saw an opportunity to modernize the empire without looking weak, and she took it, and you gave her that opportunity." Over the next 3 months, Maya watched as the changes rippled through Selenari society. And it was not easy, and there was resistance from the old families, and some of them threatened to rebel. But the Empress held firm, and slowly things began to shift, and more people started speaking out against forced marriages, and against the cruel treatment of servants, and against the idea that the Selenari were inherently superior to other species. Maya spent that time teaching at a medical station on the border, Moon of Talus, and she had volunteered to train young Selenari healers in human medical techniques, and at first they had been reluctant to learn from a human, but after they saw what she could do, they became eager students, and Maya found that she loved teaching almost as much as she loved healing. Lyris visited often, and she brought Silverwind, who was now fully healed and flying better than ever. And they would sit on the landing platform and watch the stars and talk about everything and nothing. And Maya realized that she had found something she had not even known she was looking for, and she had found a purpose and a place where she belonged. One evening, Lyris said, "I have been thinking about what you did for me and how you risked everything to help a stranger. And I want to do the same, and I want to help others who are trapped by tradition or injustice. And I want to make a difference." Maya smiled and said, "Then you should. And the galaxy needs more people. Like you," Lyris said. "Will you help me? And I do not know where to start." Maya thought about it and then said, "Yes, and I will help you, and we can start by setting up a sanctuary for people who need to escape bad situations, and we can provide them with protection and medical care and maybe even legal support, and Captain Holland might be able to help us get funding." And that was how the Sanctuary Network began. And it started small, with just a few rooms on the medical station and a handful of volunteers, but word spread quickly. And soon people from all over the sector were coming to them for help, and there were Selenari escaping forced marriages, and there were members of other species fleeing persecution, and there were refugees from wars and disasters, and Maya and Lyris helped them all. 2 years after that first meeting in the forest, Maya stood on the observation deck of the medical station and watched as a Selenari warship approached, and at first she tensed because old habits died hard, but then she saw the diplomatic flags and she relaxed. Captain Holland came to stand beside her and said, "That is the Empress's personal flagship," and she sent a message saying she wanted to meet with you personally. Maya felt nervous and said, "Did she say why?" Holland smiled and said something about a proposal, "and I think you are going to like it." The Empress arrived with minimal ceremony, and she looked around the medical station with interest, and she asked Maya to show her the sanctuary, and Maya did, and she introduced the Empress to some of the people they had helped and told her their stories. When the tour was finished, the Empress said, "You have built something remarkable here, and you are changing lives and changing minds, and I want to support this work officially. And I am proposing a partnership between the Selenari Empire and the United Earth Alliance to expand the Sanctuary Network across the entire sector." Maya was speechless, and finally she managed to say, "That would be incredible." The Empress nodded and said, "We have been wrong about many things, but we are learning, and your people have taught us that strength is not just about power or tradition, and it is also about compassion and adaptation, and the willingness to change. And I want the Empire to be part of that change." 6 months later, the expanded Sanctuary Network opened facilities on 12 worlds, and Maya was named director, and Lyris was her deputy, and they worked together to create safe spaces where anyone could find help regardless of their species or status or past. And when the Korath Dominion invaded the sector 2 years after that and threatened to destroy everything they had built, it was human ships that arrived first to defend the Selenari worlds, and it was Selenari dragons that fought alongside human fighters, and together they pushed back the invasion and proved that different species could work together when they chose to see each other as equals. Maya stood on the bridge of the horizon during the final battle and watched as Lyris and Silverwind led a squadron of dragon riders against the Korath flagship, and she felt a surge of pride and love for her friend. And when the battle was won and everyone was celebrating, Maya found Lyris in the hangar. Lyris was exhausted, and her armor was scorched, and her hair was wild, but she was grinning, and she said, "We won." Maya hugged her and said, "Yes, we did. And we won because we stood together." Lyris pulled back and said, "None of this would have happened if you had not stopped to help a stranger in the forest, and you changed everything, Maya, and you changed me, and you changed the Empire, and you showed us all what it means to be truly strong." Maya shook her head and said, "No, and you changed yourself. And I just gave you the chance, and that is all any of us can do, and we can give each other chances, and the rest is up to us." Years later, when Maya retired from active service and went back to Earth to teach at the medical academy, she would tell her students about the day she met an elf woman with a broken dragon and how that meeting changed the course of galactic history. And she would tell them that the most important thing they could learn was not how to set bones or treat infections, and it was how to see people who needed help and have the courage to do something about it. And somewhere in the stars, Lyris and Silverwind continued to fly, and they brought hope to those who had none. And they proved every day that change was possible, and that even the oldest empires could learn new ways when someone was brave enough to show them how.